Israel versus Iran, the conflict written before it began, Bible's warning. Long before the missiles. Long before the nuclear threats. Long before the world ever trembled at the name Iran. There was a whisper in the ancient texts, a warning carved in sacred stone, a blueprint written in blood and prophecy. What if I told you that the rising storm between Israel and Iran isn't breaking news, it's ancient news, that somewhere in the dust-covered pages of your Bible, this exact moment was already seen, already written, already warned about by voices that spoke from beyond the veil of time? Tonight, we're going to crack open something that has been hidden in plain sight for over 2.5 millennia, because the nation you know as Iran once bore a different name, a name that echoes through the corridors of Scripture, like thunder before the storm, Persia. And here's what will shake you to your core. Persia isn't just mentioned in the Bible, it's woven into the very fabric of prophecy itself. From the throne rooms of ancient Babylon to the coming battle of Armageddon, this land, this people, this spiritual force has been moving through God's timeline like a chess piece positioned by the Almighty Himself. You see, most people read their newspapers and think they're watching politics. But what if you're actually watching prophecy? What if every headline, every threat, every alliance forming in the shadows was already scripted by the hand of the Most High? What if the current tension isn't random but orchestrated by a divine plan that stretches from the Garden of Eden to the Second Coming? The prophet Ezekiel saw it. Daniel lived through it. Esther risked her life because of it. And now, in our generation, in our time, the final act is beginning to unfold. But here's the question that should haunt every believer alive today. If God could name Iran by its ancient name thousands of years before this moment, if He could predict this exact conflict before America was even discovered, if every move on the geopolitical chessboard was already foreseen, then what else does He know about what's coming next? And more importantly, are you ready for the answer? Chapter 1. When the bloodlines divided. In the desert silence, 2 sons cried from the same tent. Only one would carry the covenant. Picture this moment. The sand still holds the warmth of day, but night has fallen like a curtain across the ancient world. Inside Abraham's tent, 2 voices pierce the darkness. 2 boys. 2 futures. 2 nations that would one day stand on opposite sides of prophecy itself. You think you know this story. But what if I told you that in that tent, in that moment, the seeds of today's headlines were already being planted? That the tension you see flashing across your television screen between Israel and Iran was born not in modern politics, but in the heartbeat of 2 children who would never truly understand why their father's God seemed to choose one over the other? Abraham held them both. Ishmael, his firstborn, strong, wild, full of promise and human ambition. Isaac, the miracle child born when hope was dead, when Sarah's womb had already surrendered to time. Both sons of the same father, both carrying the same blood, but only one would inherit the covenant that would echo through eternity. The Scripture doesn't hide the pain. "Cast out this bondwoman and her son," Sarah demanded. "For the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac." Genesis 21:10. Can you hear the anguish in Abraham's heart? Can you feel the weight of a father forced to choose between his children? But this wasn't just family drama. This was the first fracture in what would become a spiritual fault line that still shakes the earth today. Ishmael walked into the wilderness carrying more than water and bread. He carried a wound, a question that would burn in the desert sun and birth nations. Why was I not chosen? Why was I not enough? And from that wound, from that ancient cry, would spring the ancestors of the Arab world, proud, powerful, and forever circling the promise they could see, but never fully possess. But here's what most people miss. God didn't abandon Ishmael. Listen to the promise. "I will make him fruitful, and will greatly increase his numbers. 12 rulers will come from him, and I will make him into a great nation." Genesis 17:20. Ishmael wasn't cursed. He was blessed. But his blessing would always be defined by what it was not. He would be great, but not chosen. Mighty, but not covenant. Meanwhile, Isaac carried something different into his future. Not just his father's blessing, but the weight of divine selection. Through his line would come Jacob, who would become Israel. Through Israel would come the 12 tribes. Through the tribes would come the Messiah. The promise wasn't just about land or descendants, it was about the salvation of the world flowing through one specific bloodline. But the story doesn't end with Abraham's tent, because while Isaac's descendants were settling in Canaan, other sons were spreading across the ancient world. Genesis 10 gives us the roadmap, the table of nations that most people skip over without realizing they're reading the blueprint of world history. Japheth, Noah's son, had a descendant named Madai. From Madai came the Medes, and the Medes would one day unite with another people, the Persians, to create an empire that would reshape the ancient world. Iran's bloodline doesn't just trace to Ishmael, it flows from the very sons of Noah, from the earliest chapters of the human story. Do you see what's happening here? God wasn't just arranging a family, he was positioning nations. He was setting the stage for a drama that would play out across millennia. The descendants of Isaac would carry the covenant. The descendants of Ishmael and Japheth would test it, challenge it, and ultimately be used by God to refine it. This is why the conflict between Israel and Iran feels so ancient, so primal, so impossible to resolve through diplomacy alone. Because it's not really about borders or oil or nuclear weapons. It's about something that was fractured in a tent 4,000 years ago. It's about promise and pride, about chosen and unchosen, about covenant and competition. Have you ever felt close to the promise, but not chosen to carry it? Have you ever watched someone else receive what you thought should be yours? Then you understand the spiritual wound that still bleeds through the descendants of these ancient bloodlines. It's not just political, it's personal, it's not just historical, it's spiritual. But here's the mystery that will haunt you. God knew this would happen. He saw the division coming before he ever promised Abraham a son. He knew that blessing one would wound the other. He knew that choosing Isaac would create Ishmael's cry, and yet he did it anyway. Why? Because the story was never just about these two boys. It was about all of us. Every human heart that has ever felt passed over, overlooked, unchosen. Every soul that has watched the blessing flow to someone else. God allowed the wound because he knew that one day, through the line of Isaac, would come a Messiah who would heal every ancient hurt, who would open the covenant to all nations, who would make a way for even the descendants of Ishmael to find their place in the promise. The tent is long gone. Abraham's voice has been silent for millennia, but the echo of that ancient division still thunders across the Middle East, still shapes the headlines, still positions armies and threatens peace. But even outside the covenant, God was already naming kings. Chapter 2. The Mountain Sons of Madai. Long before Iran, there were warriors in the snow-covered highlands of Madai, bloodlines of prophecy beneath stone. Picture this. The world's still wet from the floodwaters. The ark rests silent on Ararat's peak. And from that wooden vessel emerges not just humanity's second chance, but the seeds of every conflict, every kingdom, every covenant that would shake the earth for millennia to come. Noah steps onto dry ground with 3 sons, 3 names that would father nations, 3 bloodlines that would carry the weight of eternity, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But tucked within their genealogies, hidden like buried treasure in the book of Genesis, are names that most skip over. Names that hold the keys to understanding why your evening news feels like the opening of ancient scrolls. Genesis 10:2 whispers a secret most have never heard. The sons of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. Did you catch it? Madai. 1 name among 7. 1 son whose descendants would climb into the rugged mountains of what we now call Iran and build something that would outlast empires. The Medes, mountain people, warriors shaped by wind and stone, by winters that tested the soul, and summers that baked endurance into their bones. They didn't know they were part of a divine chess game. They didn't know that their tribal councils and war cries were being woven into prophecies that wouldn't be understood for 1,000 years. But God knew. And while Madai's children were learning to fight in the northern peaks, another son was rising in the south. Not from Japheth's line, but from Shem's. His name was Elam. Genesis 10:22 marks him as the father of the Elamites, a people who would settle in the fertile lowlands, near the Persian Gulf, in the shadow of Babylon's future glory. 2 currents, 2 spiritual DNA streams, Madai from the north, Elam from the south, both destined to merge into something that would make pharaohs tremble and cause Daniel to fall on his face in terror. both carrying within their bloodlines the capacity for both divine purpose and satanic rage. Can you see it? Before there was ever a Persian empire, before Cyrus was even a whisper in heaven's council, God was positioning the pieces, the Medes and the Elamites, mountain strength and valley wisdom, northern warriors and southern strategists, all unknowingly preparing for roles they wouldn't understand until the curtain of eternity was pulled back. But here's what will haunt you. These weren't random tribal migrations. This wasn't ancient history happening by accident. Every step deeper into the mountains, every settlement near a river, every marriage that bound clan to clan was being guided by an invisible hand toward a moment when the God of Abraham would need a foreign king to set his people free. What if I told you that your own family tree, your own unexpected turns, your own seeming coincidences might be part of a story much larger than you've ever imagined? What if the very struggles that have shaped your bloodline are preparing you for something you haven't seen yet? Because that's what was happening in the highlands of Madai and the valleys of Elam. Generations of people living, fighting, marrying, dying, never knowing they were being molded for a divine appointment, never knowing that their great-great-great-grandsons would one day hold the keys to Jerusalem's restoration. The Medes learned to be fierce. They had to be. The mountains don't coddle the weak. They developed military tactics that would make Alexander the Great take note centuries later. They forged alliances that would topple the mighty Assyrian Empire. They became the kind of people who could look Babylon in the eye and not blink. Meanwhile, the Elamites became masters of the Fertile Crescent. They understood irrigation, commerce, and the delicate art of statecraft. They learned how to turn geographic advantages into political power. They became the kind of people who could administrate an empire that stretched from India to Ethiopia. And all the while, in tents and palaces far to the west, Abraham's descendants were crying out under Egyptian whips, then wandering in wilderness, then building a temple in Jerusalem, then watching that temple burn, then weeping by Babylon's rivers, never knowing that their rescue was being prepared in bloodlines they'd never heard of, among peoples they'd never met. This is how God works. While you're focused on your immediate crisis, He's been moving pieces into place for generations. While you're praying for breakthrough, He's been preparing the very people who will become the answer to prayers you haven't even prayed yet. The spiritual DNA was being written, not in the stars, but in the decisions of ordinary people who had no idea they were part of an extraordinary plan. Every time a Median warrior chose courage over cowardice, every time an Elamite leader chose wisdom over pride, they were contributing to a genetic and spiritual legacy that would eventually produce the kind of king who could hear God's voice, even though he'd never been to temple. Could your history be whispering a destiny you don't yet understand? And when the kings of the east marched westward, a covenant was tested in blood. Chapter 3. Abraham's shadow over Elam. Lot was taken, but the war was not just about family, it was a challenge to heaven's promise. Picture this moment, frozen in the amber of eternity. A young man named Lot, nephew to the father of nations, dragged away in chains by foreign kings whose names would echo through prophecy for millennia to come. Genesis 14 opens like the first rumble of distant thunder, announcing a storm that would rage for 4,000 years and counting. 4 kings from the east had swept down like locusts upon the Jordan Valley. At their head rode Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, that ancient land nestled in what we now call southwestern Iran. His name rolls off the tongue like a death sentence. Chedorlaomer. In the original tongue, it meant servant of the god, Lagamar. But on this day, this servant of a pagan deity was about to discover whose God truly ruled the earth. For 14 years, these eastern kings had held the cities of the plain under their iron fist. Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim all paid tribute to these distant overlords. But in the 13th year, rebellion stirred. The cities refused to bow. And so came the 14th year, when Chedorlaomer and his alliance marched west to crush the uprising and remind the world who held dominion over the known earth. What these kings didn't know, what they couldn't possibly fathom, was that among the spoils of their conquest sat a young man whose blood carried the very promise of God. Lot wasn't just Abraham's nephew. He was a living extension of the covenant, a branch grafted into the tree of divine purpose. When those foreign hands seized him, they weren't just taking a captive. They were laying hands on heaven's chosen lineage. Can you imagine Abraham's face when the messenger arrived? Breathless, and dust-covered, with news that would turn his world upside down. "Your nephew has been taken, my lord. The eastern kings have swept through the valley like a plague. Lot is gone." But Abraham didn't weep. He didn't wring his hands or send diplomats or offer ransom. No, something far more dangerous stirred in the heart of the man who walked with God. Abraham gathered his trained servants, all 318 of them, and set out in pursuit of the most powerful military alliance in the known world. Think about those numbers for a moment. 318 household servants against the combined armies of 4 kingdoms. It wasn't just impossible. It was laughable. Chedorlaomer commanded thousands upon thousands of battle-hardened warriors, men who had just laid waste to 5 cities and were drunk on victory. Abraham brought shepherds and tent makers, men who knew more about milking goats than wielding swords. But here's what the kings of the East hadn't calculated into their equations of power. They had touched what God had blessed. They had laid hands on the seed through which all nations would be blessed. They had declared war not just on a man, but on a promise written in the stars themselves. Under cover of darkness, Abraham divided his tiny force and struck. And what happened next defies every law of military strategy ever conceived. The Eastern Alliance, this juggernaut that had rolled over fortified cities, scattered like leaves before a hurricane. The servants of Abraham, empowered by something far beyond their natural strength, pursued the fleeing armies all the way to Damascus. Chedorlaomer, the mighty king of Elam, fled for his life. His chariots became kindling. His treasures became Abraham's spoil. His reputation crumbled like dust in the wind. The man who had thought himself master of the earth discovered in a single night that there are powers in heaven that laugh at earthly thrones. But this wasn't just a rescue mission. This wasn't just a father figure protecting his family. This was the first recorded clash between the covenant of God and the spirit of what would one day become Iran. This was prophecy written in blood and sand, a dress rehearsal for a conflict that would span the ages. You see, Elam, this ancient kingdom that dared to chain the seed of promise, sits in the very heart of modern-day Iran. The same soil that bred Chedorlaomer's arrogance now hosts the Ayatollahs who call for Israel's destruction. The same mountains that echoed with the war cries of the Eastern Alliance now ring with chants of death to America, death to Israel. What if I told you this isn't coincidence? What if the hostility we see today between Iran and Israel isn't rooted in modern politics, but in spiritual rebellion that stretches back to the days when the earth was young and God's promises were still settling into history like morning dew? Abraham's victory over Chedorlaomer was more than military triumph. It was a divine declaration. Touch my chosen, and you touch the apple of my eye. Challenge my covenant, and you challenge the very throne of heaven. The king of Elam learned this lesson the hard way, fleeing into the night with nothing but the clothes on his back and the bitter taste of defeat on his tongue. But Elam, proud, ancient Elam, would not forget. The humiliation would fester like an infected wound, passed down through generations, evolving from political grievance into spiritual rebellion. The land that once bowed to pagan gods would one day cloak itself in religious fervor, but the hatred would remain the same. The target would remain unchanged. And as the fire of Babylon rose, heaven stirred a name buried in the dust. Chapter 4. The Anointed Who Never Knew God. Before Cyrus ever breathed, heaven had already spoken his name. Picture this. In the throne room of eternity, before time began its march, before empires rose and fell like waves upon the shore, God looked down the corridors of history and saw a man, a pagan king, a ruler who would never bow his knee in worship, never utter a prayer, never acknowledge the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And yet, God called him my shepherd. God called him my anointed. How does the mind of man comprehend such sovereignty? How does the heart wrestle with such mystery? 150 years before Cyrus the Great ever drew his first breath, the prophet Isaiah stood in the courts of Jerusalem and spoke words that should have been impossible. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped to subdue nations before him. The ink was still wet on Isaiah's scroll when baby Cyrus was nothing more than a distant dream in the mind of the Almighty. Think about that. While the people of Israel were still walking free in their land, while the temple still stood in all its glory, while Jerusalem's walls were strong and her gates secure, God was already naming the man who would one day restore what had not yet been destroyed. This is the chess game of eternity. This is the mind of God moving pieces across the board of history before the players even know they're in the game. The year was 559 BC when a young Persian nobleman stepped onto the stage of history. Cyrus, son of Cambyses, heir to a small kingdom in the rugged mountains of what we now call Iran. But this was no ordinary prince. This was a man with a divine appointment written in the stars before his grandfather was born. As Cyrus began his meteoric rise, conquering kingdom after kingdom, empire after empire, something supernatural was unfolding. The Median Empire fell to his sword. Lydia crumbled before his armies. And then, he set his sights on the greatest prize of all, Babylon, the golden head of empires. The beast that had devoured Jerusalem, burned the temple, and dragged God's people into chains. But here's what sends chills down the spine of anyone who truly understands the ways of God. Cyrus wasn't just conquering, he was fulfilling. Every victory, every battle, every strategic move was the hand of the Almighty guiding a man who didn't even know he was being guided. Daniel, that faithful prophet, was there in the palace when the walls of Babylon fell. He was there when the empire that seemed invincible crumbled in a single night. And as the dust settled and the smoke cleared, what did Cyrus do? What was his first royal decree as the new master of the known world? The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house at Jerusalem. Can you hear the echo of Isaiah's prophecy in those words? Can you feel the weight of divine sovereignty pressing down through the centuries? Here was a man who worshipped the fire god Ahura Mazda, a king who had never read the Torah, never heard the Shema, never stood in the courts of the temple, and yet he was speaking the language of Yahweh. He was acknowledging the God of Israel as the Lord of heaven and earth. This wasn't politics. This was prophecy in motion. The exiles who had wept by the rivers of Babylon suddenly found themselves free, not because they had fought for freedom, not because they had earned it or deserved it, but because a pagan king, moved by an invisible hand, opened their prison doors and funded their journey home. Imagine the tears streaming down weathered faces as families packed their belongings for a homeland they thought they'd never see again. Imagine the old men who had been boys when Jerusalem fell, now walking back toward the city of their dreams with trembling legs and hearts full of wonder. And who paid for it all? Who provided the resources, the protection, the royal decree that made it possible? Cyrus, the Persian, the outsider, the one who had never made a covenant with the God of Abraham, yet somehow had become his most unlikely instrument of mercy. But the restoration didn't stop with freedom. Cyrus didn't just open the prison door, she rebuilt the prison into a palace. He didn't just release the captive, she restored their dignity. The temple vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had stolen and placed in pagan shrines were carefully cataloged, cleaned, and returned. The gold, the silver, the sacred instruments of worship, all of it came home. When the foundation of the new temple was laid, the sound that rose from Jerusalem wasn't just celebration, it was the sound of prophecy fulfilling itself. It was the sound of God's faithfulness echoing across the centuries. It was the sound of a promise kept by a God who moves kings like chess pieces and turns the hearts of rulers like streams of water. And Cyrus? He watched it all unfold, perhaps never fully understanding that he had been the starring actor in a drama written by the hand of the Almighty. He had been anointed for a purpose that stretched far beyond his Persian empire. He had been chosen to demonstrate that God's sovereignty knows no borders, recognizes no earthly kingdoms, and bows to no human power. This is the God who calls things that are not as though they are. This is the God who names kings before they're born and moves empires to accomplish his will. This is the God who can take the very instrument of your oppression and transform it into the key to your freedom. Could the very hand that once oppressed you become the one that opens your prison? But here's what should make every believer tremble with holy awe. If God could reach into the heart of a pagan Persian king and move him to rebuild Jerusalem, if he could use an empire that didn't know him to restore a people who did, what is he doing in your life right now that you can't see? What circumstances that look like opposition might actually be divine orchestration? What Cyrus is God raising up in your generation to accomplish his purposes? The story of Cyrus isn't just ancient history. It's a window into the heart of a God who works all things together for good. It's a reminder that his thoughts are higher than our thoughts, his ways higher than our ways. It's proof that even when everything looks impossible, even when the enemies seem too strong and the walls too high, God has already written the end of the story. But empires grow proud, and prophecy does not stay still. Chapter 5. Esther's crown in the empire of death. A royal crown, hiding a Jewish soul. In the opulent halls of Susa, where Persian gold caught the light of 1,000 oil lamps, where the empire's heart beat with the rhythm of absolute power, a secret was walking the marble corridors. Her name was Hatshepsut. The world knew her as Esther. And behind the silk and sapphires, behind the royal diadem that graced her brow, beat the heart of a covenant child whose very existence would soon stand between her people and the abyss. Picture this: the most powerful empire on earth, stretching from the scorching sands of Ethiopia to the distant rivers of India, 127 provinces bowing to a single throne. And on that throne sat Xerxes, a king whose word was law, whose decree was destiny, whose anger could reshape nations. Yet in his very palace, in his own bedchambers, God had planted a seed of deliverance that the king himself could never have imagined. But darkness was stirring in those same corridors. His name was Haman, descendant of Agag, blood of the Amalekites, ancient enemy of the people of promise. And the hatred that pulsed through his veins was not merely political, it was spiritual, ancestral, demonic. When Mordecai, Esther's cousin, refused to bow before this prince of pride, something primeval awakened in Haman's soul, the same spirit that had whispered to Pharaoh to drown Hebrew babies, that had urged Saul to destroy the Amalekites, now hissed its venomous plan into Haman's ear. Why kill one Jew when you can kill them all? The decree went out on the 13th day of the first month, sealed with the king's own signet ring. From the mountains of Media to the deserts of Arabia, from the trading posts of Babylon to the ports of the Mediterranean, a single message echoed across the empire. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, all Jews young and old, women and children were to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. Genocide, written in royal ink, stamped with imperial authority, the final solution, 25 centuries before Hitler ever drew breath. Can you imagine the silence that must have fallen over the Jewish communities scattered across that vast empire? The mothers clutching their children, the elders remembering the promises of Abraham, the young men wondering if this was how the story of God's people would end, not in glory, but in a Persian grave. But heaven had been watching, heaven had been planning, and heaven had already positioned its answer in the most unlikely place, the very heart of the empire that now threatened to destroy God's chosen people. Mordecai's message to Esther still thunders across the centuries. Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Such a time as this. 4 words that should haunt every believer who has ever wondered why God placed them where they are, when they are, with the influence they have. 4 words that remind us that divine positioning is never accidental, never random, never without purpose. Esther faced a choice that would echo through eternity. She could remain silent, safe behind her royal identity, hoping the storm would pass. Or she could step into the fire, risk everything, and become the vessel through which God would once again use Persia to deliver his people. For 3 days, she fasted. For 3 days, she prayed. For 3 days, she wrestled with a God who had placed an impossible burden on her shoulders. And then, with words that still inspire courage in every generation, she spoke her surrender. If I perish, I perish. The throne room scene that followed was nothing less than divine theater. Unbidden, unsummoned, Esther approached the king. One step could mean death. Persian law was Absalop approached the throne without invitation, and the sword awaits. But as she crossed that marble floor, as her heart pounded against her ribs, as the eyes of the empire turned toward her, the king's golden scepter extended, grace in the face of certain judgment. Life offered where death was deserved. The banquets that followed were strategic masterpieces. Esther didn't rush. She didn't panic. She waited for the divine moment, the Kairos time when heaven would intersect earth. And when that moment came, when Haman sat gorged with wine and drunk on his own pride, Esther struck with the precision of a prophetess. If we had only been sold into slavery, I would have remained silent, but a decree has gone out for my people and for me to be destroyed. The king's rage was volcanic. Who would dare do such a thing? Our enemy is this wicked man, Haman. In that instant, the hunter became the hunted. The architect of genocide became its first casualty. The gallows that Haman had built for Mordecai became his own execution platform. 75 feet high, visible from across the city, a monument to the principle that what you prepare for others, God may prepare for you. But the greater miracle was yet to come. Persian law could not be reversed, not even by the king himself. The decree of death still stood. But what could not be undone could be countered. A new decree went out, sealed with the same royal ring carried by the same swift messengers. On the appointed day, the Jews could defend themselves. And when that day came, when the forces of darkness thought they would feast on Jewish blood, the tables turned. 75,000 enemies fell. The hunters became the hunted. The day planned for Jewish destruction became a day of Jewish triumph, and Purim, the Feast of Lots, was born from what should have been a funeral. Esther's story is more than history. It's prophecy. It's a preview of the cosmic reversal that God specializes in taking what the enemy means for evil and transforming it into his good. It's a reminder that sometimes God doesn't deliver us from the lion's den. Sometimes he delivers us in it. But there's something deeper here. Something that should make every believer tremble with holy awe. Esther's intercession in the Persian court is a dress rehearsal for another intercession, another throne room, another moment when death threatened God's people and deliverance came through unexpected sacrifice. Esther walked uninvited into an earthly throne room, risking death for her people. Jesus walked uninvited into the cosmic throne room of justice, accepting death for his people. Esther's "If I perish, I perish" echoes forward to Gethsemane's "Not my will, but yours be done." And Persia, once again, became the unlikely stage for divine drama. The same empire that had freed the exiles under Cyrus now protected them under Xerxes. The same soil that would one day threaten Israel's existence had twice become the theater of her salvation. But here's what should chill your soul. The spirit that moved Haman didn't die with him. The hatred that built those gallows, that drafted that decree, that celebrated the thought of Jewish extinction, that spirit merely changed addresses. It found new hosts, new nations, new expressions. And today, in the halls of Tehran, in the speeches of ayatollahs, in the chants of death to Israel, that same ancient hatred breathes. What if you were placed behind enemy walls for such a time as this? What if your position, your influence, your moment in history isn't about your comfort but about God's purpose? What if, like Esther, you've been crowned not for your own glory but for someone else's deliverance? But the spirit that built gallows in Persia would not rest in the grave. Chapter 6. The Prince Behind the Throne. For 21 days, the angel could not break through because the Prince of Persia stood in the way. Picture this moment, if you can, an elderly Hebrew exile, weathered by decades in Babylon, kneeling by the banks of the Tigris River. For 3 weeks, Daniel had been fasting, mourning, seeking the face of God with a desperation that carved lines deeper into his ancient face. No choice food had touched his lips. No wine had passed his throat. His body trembled, not from age, but from the weight of unanswered prayer. And then, heaven tore open. A being of terrifying glory materialized before him, face like lightning, eyes like blazing torches, arms and legs gleaming like polished bronze, voice thundering like the roar of a multitude. This was no gentle Sunday school angel. This was a warrior from the throne room of the Almighty, and he brought with him a revelation that would shatter everything Daniel thought he knew about the nature of earthly power. "Do not be afraid, Daniel," the angel declared, his voice still echoing with the authority of eternity. "Since the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to them." But then came the words that should make every believer's blood run cold. "But the prince of the Persian kingdom resisted me 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, because I was detained there with the king of Persia." Do you hear what just happened? For 3 weeks, 21 days, a messenger from the throne of God Almighty was locked in spiritual combat with a demonic entity so powerful, so entrenched, so spiritually territorial that it took the archangel Michael himself to break the deadlock. This wasn't a disagreement. This wasn't a political negotiation. This was war in the heavenly realms, invisible to human eyes but more real than any battle ever fought with sword and shield. And at the center of this cosmic conflict stood Persia, not just as an empire of gold and marble, but as a spiritual battleground where the forces of darkness had established a throne. The Prince of Persia. Let that title settle into your spirit. Not a human prince, but a fallen principality, a demonic ruler assigned by the kingdom of darkness to influence, manipulate, and control the very empire that held God's people in exile. This supernatural entity had been given dominion over the thoughts of kings, the policies of government, the spiritual atmosphere of an entire civilization. And here's what should terrify every person watching this. That same principality, that same spiritual force, that same prince of Persia never died. Demons don't die with empires. Spiritual powers don't crumble with kingdoms. They migrate, they adapt, they wait for their moment to rise again. What Daniel glimpsed in that vision by the river was the terrifying truth that most of humanity never sees. Behind every earthly throne sits an invisible throne. Behind every political decision whispers a spiritual influence. Behind every empire's rise and fall moves the ancient chess game between heaven and hell. The prophet Ezekiel would later warn of this same dark power when he spoke of the spiritual force behind the king of Tyre. You were the anointed cherub who covers. I established you. You were on the holy mountain of God. You were perfect in your ways from the day you were created, till iniquity was found in you. This wasn't just about a human king. This was about the fallen principality pulling the strings. And Paul the Apostle would echo this revelation centuries later when he wrote to the Ephesians, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." So when you see Iran today, when you watch its leaders foam with hatred against Israel, when you witness its relentless pursuit of nuclear weapons, when you observe its funding of terror networks across the Middle East, don't just see politics. Don't just see religion. See the Prince of Persia, still resisting, still raging, still warring against the covenant people of God. This ancient spiritual entity that once delayed heaven's messenger for 3 weeks is the same dark force that whispers in the corridors of Tehran today. The same principality that influenced the courts of ancient Babylon now moves through the councils of modern Iran. The geography has remained. The spiritual rulership has endured. But here's what Daniel's vision reveals about our current moment. The conflict between Israel and Iran isn't just about nuclear programs or proxy wars or territorial disputes. It's about the continuation of a spiritual war that began in the heavenly realms thousands of years ago. When Iran threatens to wipe Israel off the map, it's not just Iranian leadership speaking. It's the Prince of Persia, still resisting God's plan, still opposing his covenant, still trying to thwart the purposes of the Almighty. And yet in this is crucial, Daniel's encounter also reveals something else. The angel eventually broke through. Michael came to help. Heaven's message was delivered. God's purposes were not thwarted by 21 days of spiritual warfare. The Prince of Persia could delay, but he could not destroy. He could resist, but he could not reverse the will of the Most High. This should give every believer tremendous hope. Yes, the spiritual battle is real. Yes, demonic principalities rule over nations. Yes, there are invisible powers working against God's people and God's plan. But they are not sovereign. They are not omnipotent. They operate only within the boundaries that the Almighty allows, and their ultimate defeat was sealed at Calvary. So when you pray for Israel, you're not just praying against human hatred. You're praying against the Prince of Persia. When you stand with God's covenant people, you're not just taking a political position. You're taking a spiritual position in the ancient war between light and darkness. When you intercede for peace in the Middle East, your prayers are ascending to the same throne room that dispatched that angel to Daniel, and they carry the same power to break through demonic resistance. The question Daniel's vision poses to every believer is this: are you fighting what you see, or what's behind what you see? Are you wrestling with flesh and blood, or are you engaging the principalities and powers that manipulate flesh and blood? Are you praying against human enemies, or against the spiritual forces that incite human enmity? Because until we understand the spiritual dimension of this ancient conflict, we will never understand why Israel remains the most contested piece of land on earth. We will never comprehend why Iran's hatred burns with such supernatural intensity. We will never grasp why this region continues to be the flashpoint for global tension. The Prince of Persia still stands behind the throne, but the God of Daniel still sits above all thrones. And the same Michael who came to help heaven's messenger 2.5 millennia ago is still standing guard over those who belong to the covenant. The battle is real. The enemy is ancient, but the victory belongs to the Lord. And as Daniel watched the vision fade and the angel disappear back into the invisible realm from which he came, Persia's time would rise again. Chapter 7. The Scrolls of Ezekiel. Begin to burn. A storm from the north, a name written in the ashes, Persia. There comes a moment in every prophet's life when the veil between heaven and earth becomes so thin that eternity bleeds through. For Ezekiel, that moment came by the rivers of Babylon, where the exiled children of Israel wept for their homeland. The sky cracked open like an ancient scroll, and what he saw there would haunt the corridors of prophecy until the end of time. Picture this: an old man, weathered by captivity, kneeling by foreign waters, his people scattered like seed in the wind, the Temple of Solomon nothing but ash and memory, and then the voice, not a whisper, but a roar that shook the foundations of creation itself. "Son of man," it thundered, "set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him." But it wasn't just Gog that made Ezekiel's blood run cold. It was the name that followed, a name that had once been written in gold in the courts of deliverance, a name that had broken the chains of Babylon and funded the rebuilding of God's house: Persia. Listen carefully to what the Almighty spoke through trembling lips. "Persia, Cush, and Put will be with them, all with shields and helmets." Ezekiel 38:5. The same Persia that had been God's anointed instrument now stood among the enemies of Israel. The liberator had become the destroyer. The shepherd had turned wolf. Can you feel the weight of that revelation? The nation that once carried the key to Jerusalem's restoration would one day march with the armies of darkness to bring about her destruction. It's as if heaven itself was weeping at the sight, watching a former friend prepare for war against the covenant people. But this isn't just another ancient battle prophecy gathering dust on library shelves. This is a window into the very heart of spiritual warfare itself. Because what Ezekiel saw wasn't merely political, it was cosmic. A final rebellion against the throne of the Most High, orchestrated by powers and principalities that have been plotting since the serpent first whispered in Eden. Think about it. Gog, this mysterious prince from the uttermost north, doesn't just wake up one morning and decide to invade Israel. No, Scripture tells us something far more chilling. "I will turn you around, put hooks into your jaws, and bring you out with all your army." Ezekiel 38:4. God himself is orchestrating this invasion. The Almighty is drawing the nations like moths to a flame, positioning them for one final demonstration of his power. And at the head of this unholy alliance, Persia, modern-day Iran, the very nation that today echoes the ancient war cries of Haman, promising to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. The same spirit that once whispered genocide in the Persian palace now shouts it from the minarets of Tehran. But here's what should make every believer's heart race with both terror and anticipation. Ezekiel didn't just see the gathering storm. He saw the fire that would consume it. "And I will rain down on him, on his troops, and on the many peoples who are with him, flooding rain, great hailstones, fire, and brimstone." Ezekiel 38-22. This isn't just divine justice. This is divine revelation. When the armies of Gog and Magog surround Jerusalem like a noose around the neck of prophecy, when Persia leads the charge against the apple of God's eye, when it seems like all hope is lost, that's when heaven intervenes. Not with diplomacy, not with negotiations, with fire from the throne room of eternity itself. And why? Listen to the heartbeat of God in this moment. "Thus I will magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations. Then they shall know that I am the Lord." Ezekiel 38-23. This isn't about politics or territory or oil reserves. This is about the name and reputation of the living God. This is about a covenant that cannot be broken, a promise that will not be denied, a people who cannot be destroyed because they carry the signature of the Almighty himself. Do you see what's happening here? The same nation that God once used to deliver Israel will become the instrument he uses to display his glory to the world. Persia's betrayal isn't a surprise to heaven, it's part of the plan. The ultimate reversal. The final plot twist in a story that began in a garden and will end on a mountain. But perhaps the most haunting part of Ezekiel's vision isn't the invasion itself. It's the timing. "In the latter years you will come into the land of those brought back from the sword and gathered from many people on the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate." Ezekiel 38-8. He's describing a time when Israel has been regathered from the nations, when the land is no longer desolate, when the Jewish people have returned home. Sound familiar? For the first time in over 2,000 years, Israel is back in her land. For the first time since Ezekiel walked the earth, his prophecy can actually be fulfilled. The stage is set. The players are in position. And Iran ancient Persia, moving into formation just as the scrolls foretold. What if I told you that every headline from the Middle East is actually a news bulletin from the throne room of God? What if every threat from Tehran is just another verse in Ezekiel's song finally being sung? What if the same name that once released Israel from captivity is now preparing to trigger the greatest display of divine power the world has ever seen? The scrolls are burning, friend. The ancient words are becoming modern reality. And the question isn't whether this prophecy will be fulfilled. The question is, are you ready to witness the moment when heaven breaks its silence and the God of Israel reminds the world exactly who sits on the throne? But Ezekiel did not only see war, he saw fire from heaven. Chapter 8. The earth will tremble, but Israel will stand. Hail, fire, thunder, and the hand of God descending in wrath. There comes a moment in the Chronicles of eternity when heaven grows silent, when the angelic hosts hold their breath, when even the seraphim cease their endless song of holy, 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 and watch as the Ancient of Days rises from his throne. This is not the God of mercy walking in the cool of Eden's evening. This is not the tender shepherd gathering his scattered flock. This is the Lord of hosts, and his fury burns like a consuming fire. The prophet Ezekiel, standing on the banks of the Chebar River, saw what mortal eyes were never meant to see. He witnessed the moment when God's patience reaches its end, when divine restraint gives way to holy vengeance, when the Almighty looks down upon the earth and declares, "Enough." Picture it. The coalition has assembled. Persia leads the charge, her banners fluttering in the desert wind. The armies of Gog have surrounded Israel like wolves circling a wounded lamb. The world holds its breath. CNN broadcasts the invasion. The United Nations calls emergency sessions. Military analysts calculate Israel's odds of survival, 0. But there's something they cannot calculate. Something no satellite can detect. Something no intelligence agency has in their files. The factor they never account for is this: Israel doesn't fight alone. In Ezekiel 38-18, the temperature of heaven changes. In that day when Gog attacks the land of Israel, my hot anger will be aroused, declares the sovereign Lord. Hot anger, not cool displeasure, not measured judgment. Hot, burning, volcanic, the kind of wrath that melts mountains and turns rivers into steam. What happens next isn't warfare. It's divine intervention. It's not military strategy. It's the finger of God writing judgment across the sky in letters of fire and blood. The earth convulses. Ezekiel 38-19 tells us there will be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. Not tremors, not minor seismic activity. A great earthquake, the kind that splits continents. The kind that makes the parting of the Red Sea look like a puddle disturbed by a child's stone. Every wall in Israel shakes. Every mountain trembles. Every living creature feels the footsteps of the Almighty as he walks across his promised land. But here's what will leave you breathless. The earthquake doesn't harm Israel. It turns the invading armies against each other. Ezekiel 38-21 declares, "Every man's sword will be against his brother." Confusion sweeps through the coalition like a plague. Persian soldiers fire on Russian troops. Libyan forces attack Ethiopian units. In their terror, they cannot tell friend from foe. The very ground beneath their feet has become their enemy. And then come the plagues. I will execute judgment on him with plague and bloodshed, God declares in verse 22. These aren't natural disasters. These are supernatural signatures. Divine fingerprints pressed into the flesh of rebellion. The same God who sent boils upon Egypt, who rained frogs upon Pharaoh, who turned the Nile to blood, now writes his name across the bodies of those who dare touch his anointed. But the climax is still coming. Fire rains from heaven, not metaphorical fire, real fire, burning sulfur falling like deadly snow, torrential rain mixed with hailstones the size of boulders. This is the artillery of the Almighty. This is what happens when the God who breathed stars into existence decides to defend a nation the size of New Jersey. Can you imagine the terror? Picture Persian commanders reaching for their radios, but there's only static. Their satellites are dark. Their GPS systems are dead. The very technology they trusted has abandoned them. All they hear is the sound of their own hearts pounding, and the voice of the wind carrying a whisper they recognize but refuse to acknowledge. I am who I am. In that moment, every atheist in the coalition becomes a believer. Every scoffer becomes a supplicant. Every mocker falls on his face. Because when God moves, doubt dies. When heaven opens, denial becomes impossible. When the Almighty speaks, even rebels remember his name. This isn't just about Iran. This isn't just about Israel. This is about every soul watching from the sidelines, wondering if there really is a God who keeps his promises. This is heaven's answer to every prayer that whispered, "How long, O Lord?" This is the divine response to every tear shed over Israel's suffering. Ezekiel 38-23 gives us God's ultimate purpose. "And so I will show my greatness and my holiness, and I will make myself known in the sight of many nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord." This isn't about revenge. This is about revelation. This isn't about destruction. This is about demonstration. God allows the coalition to gather, not because he's powerless to stop them, but because he has an audience to address. The world that has forgotten his name will remember. The nations that have denied his existence will declare his glory. The media that mocked his people will broadcast his power. And in newsrooms across the globe, anchors will struggle to find words for what they're witnessing. Because how do you describe the indescribable? How do you report on the supernatural? How do you explain what cameras capture but minds cannot comprehend? Israel's salvation won't come through the Iron Dome. It won't flow from American aid packages or United Nations resolutions. It won't emerge from diplomatic negotiations or peace treaties signed in luxury hotels. Israel's deliverance will come from the same source it always has, the covenant, keeping God who scattered nations to give them a homeland, and who will move heaven and earth to keep them there. When the smoke clears and the earth stops shaking, Iran's military might will be buried beneath divine rubble. Persia's nuclear dreams will be ash in the wind. The coalition that seemed unstoppable will be a cautionary tale told in hushed whispers. And Israel's small, surrounded, outnumbered Israel will stand, not because of their strength, but because of his faithfulness. But here's the question that should haunt every heart watching this unfold. When all your defenses fall, will God still be your shield? When your bank account can't protect you, when your insurance policies can't cover you, when your retirement plans can't sustain you, when your health fails and your strength gives way, will the God of Israel be your refuge too? Because the same hand that defends Jerusalem can defend you. The same voice that commands earthquakes can calm your storms. The same power that rains fire on Israel's enemies can rain peace on your troubled soul. But you have to choose. You have to decide. Will you stand with Israel's God, or will you stand against him? The earth will tremble, mountains will shake, nations will fall, but those who trust in the Lord will be like Mount Zion, which cannot be moved. But judgment is never God's final word. Conclusion. And so the ancient scroll closes. But not on the story. Only on the chapter we have been given to read. From the dust of Babylon to the headlines of today, we have traced a bloodline written in prophecy and sealed in divine purpose. We have watched Persia rise from the genealogies of Noah, through the courts of kings, across the visions of prophets, and into the crosshairs of eternity itself. What began as two sons in Abraham's tent, Isaac and Ishmael, promise and blessing, covenant and calling, has unfolded across millennia into a conflict that shakes nations and stirs the very throne rooms of heaven. The descendants of Madai and Elam, once scattered tribes in ancient lands, became the architects of empire, the empire that freed God's people, the empire that sheltered his chosen, the empire that would one day rise in defiance against both. Persia, Iran, the nation of 1,000 names and a single destiny. We have seen her glory, Cyrus the Anointed, opening prison gates and funding temples with the gold of conquered kingdoms. We have witnessed her valor, Esther the Hidden, risking death to save a generation from the shadow of genocide. We have marveled at her mystery, wise men from the east, following a star to worship a king they had never seen but always known. And we have glimpsed her future, armies gathered like storm clouds, weapons raised against the apple of God's eye, standing with Gog in the valley of decision where heaven and earth will collide in thunder and fire. But here is what should take your breath away. This is not a story about politics. This is not a documentary about nations. This is a revelation about the heart of God, how he weaves even rebellion into redemption, how he turns judgment into mercy, how he writes hope in the margins of every prophecy of doom. Could it be that Iran's final chapter has not yet been written? Could it be that the same soil which once produced liberators and queens might one day yield worshippers? Could it be that the land which funded the rebuilding of God's temple might bow again before his throne, not in defeat, but in recognition? Jeremiah saw it. In the latter days I will restore the fortunes of Elam. Zechariah prophesied it. Nations that once came against Jerusalem would one day ascend to worship the King. Even in the darkest visions of invasion and war, the prophets left windows open for wonder. Because this is who our God is, the one who called Rahab righteous, the one who made Ruth an ancestor of David, the one who transformed Saul into Paul and turned a cross into a crown, the God who specializes in impossible redemptions and unthinkable transformations. You are living in the days the prophets longed to see. You are witnessing headlines they wrote in tears and visions. The tensions you watch on the evening news were forecasted by voices that spoke from the whirlwind. The alliances forming in shadows were mapped by men who saw tomorrow through the lens of eternity. Iran's missiles may be aimed at Jerusalem, but heaven's eyes are fixed on something deeper. The spiritual war raging above the headlines. The battle for every soul caught between the promise and the threat. The question echoing from Eden to Armageddon. Will you bow to the King of Kings, or will you raise your fist against the Ancient of Days? This is not just Iran's choice. It is yours. It is mine. It is every heart that beats between the first prophecy and the last. Because the same God who knew Cyrus by name before Cyrus drew breath knows your name too. The same power that moved through Esther's courage can move through your obedience. The same mercy that spared Nineveh can reach the most hardened heart, the most bitter nation, the most impossible case. So watch, pray, stand alert in these prophetic hours, because the scrolls are still unrolling, the prophecies are still breathing, and somewhere in the councils of heaven, the final chapter is being written. The earth will tremble, nations will rage, but the King is coming. And when he arrives, every nation will fall, but those who trust in the Lord will be like Mount Zion, which cannot be moved. But judgment is never God's final word. Conclusion. And so the ancient scroll closes. But not on the story. Only on the chapter we have been given to read. From the dust of Babylon to the headlines of today, we have traced a bloodline written in prophecy and sealed in divine purpose. We have watched Persia rise from the genealogies of Noah, through the courts of kings, across the visions of prophets, and into the crosshairs of eternity itself. What began as two sons in Abraham's tent, Isaac and Ishmael, promise and blessing, covenant and calling, has unfolded across millennia into a conflict that shakes nations and stirs the very throne rooms of heaven. The descendants of Madai and Elam, once scattered tribes in ancient lands, became the architects of empire, the empire that freed God's people, the empire that sheltered his chosen, the empire that would one day rise in defiance against both. Persia, Iran, the nation of 1,000 names and a single destiny. We have seen her glory, Cyrus the Anointed, opening prison gates and funding temples with the gold of conquered kingdoms. We have witnessed her valor, Esther the Hidden, risking death to save a generation from the shadow of genocide. We have marveled at her mystery, wise men from the east, following a star to worship a king they had never seen but always known. And we have glimpsed her future, armies gathered like storm clouds, weapons raised against the apple of God's eye, standing with Gog in the valley of decision where heaven and earth will collide in thunder and fire. But here is what should take your breath away. This is not a story about politics. This is not a documentary about nations. This is a revelation about the heart of God, how he weaves even rebellion into redemption, how he turns judgment into mercy, how he writes hope in the margins of every prophecy of doom. Could it be that Iran's final chapter has not yet been written? Could it be that the same soil which once produced liberators and queens might one day yield worshippers? Could it be that the land which funded the rebuilding of God's temple might bow again before his throne, not in defeat, but in recognition? Jeremiah saw it. In the latter days I will restore the fortunes of Elam. Zechariah prophesied it. Nations that once came against Jerusalem would one day ascend to worship the King. Even in the darkest visions of invasion and war, the prophets left windows open for wonder. Because this is who our God is, the one who called Rahab righteous, the one who made Ruth an ancestor of David, the one who transformed Saul into Paul and turned a cross into a crown, the God who specializes in impossible redemptions and unthinkable transformations. You are living in the days the prophets longed to see. You are witnessing headlines they wrote in tears and visions. The tensions you watch on the evening news were forecasted by voices that spoke from the whirlwind. The alliances forming in shadows were mapped by men who saw tomorrow through the lens of eternity. Iran's missiles may be aimed at Jerusalem, but heaven's eyes are fixed on something deeper. The spiritual war raging above the headlines. The battle for every soul caught between the promise and the threat. The question echoing from Eden to Armageddon. Will you bow to the King of Kings, or will you raise your fist against the Ancient of Days? This is not just Iran's choice. It is yours. It is mine. It is every heart that beats between the first prophecy and the last. Because the same God who knew Cyrus by name before Cyrus drew breath knows your name too. The same power that moved through Esther's courage can move through your obedience. The same mercy that spared Nineveh can reach the most hardened heart, the most bitter nation, the most impossible case. So watch, pray, stand alert in these prophetic hours, because the scrolls are still unrolling, the prophecies are still breathing, and somewhere in the councils of heaven, the final chapter is being written. The earth will tremble, nations will rage, but the king is coming. And when he arrives, every knee will bow, Persian knees, Israeli knees, American knees, your knees and mine. Because in God's hand, even ashes can become altars, and Persia's flame may rise again, this time in worship. Nations will fall, but those who trust in the Lord will be like Mount Zion, which cannot be moved. But judgment is never God's final word. Conclusion. And so the ancient scroll closes. But not on the story. Only on the chapter we have been given to read. From the dust of Babylon to the headlines of today, we have traced a bloodline written in prophecy and sealed in divine purpose. We have watched Persia rise from the genealogies of Noah, through the courts of kings, across the visions of prophets, and into the crosshairs of eternity itself. What began as two sons in Abraham's tent, Isaac and Ishmael, promise and blessing, covenant and calling, has unfolded across millennia into a conflict that shakes nations and stirs the very throne rooms of heaven. The descendants of Madai and Elam, once scattered tribes in ancient lands, became the architects of empire, the empire that freed God's people, the empire that sheltered his chosen, the empire that would one day rise in defiance against both. Persia, Iran, the nation of 1,000 names and a single destiny. We have seen her glory, Cyrus the Anointed, opening prison gates and funding temples with the gold of conquered kingdoms. We have witnessed her valor, Esther the Hidden, risking death to save a generation from the shadow of genocide. We have marveled at her mystery, wise men from the east, following a star to worship a king they had never seen but always known. And we have glimpsed her future, armies gathered like storm clouds, weapons raised against the apple of God's eye, standing with Gog in the valley of decision where heaven and earth will collide in thunder and fire. But here is what should take your breath away. This is not a story about politics. This is not a documentary about nations. This is a revelation about the heart of God, how he weaves even rebellion into redemption, how he turns judgment into mercy, how he writes hope in the margins of every prophecy of doom. Could it be that Iran's final chapter has not yet been written? Could it be that the same soil which once produced liberators and queens might one day yield worshippers? Could it be that the land which funded the rebuilding of God's temple might bow again before his throne, not in defeat, but in recognition? Jeremiah saw it. In the latter days I will restore the fortunes of Elam. Zechariah prophesied it. Nations that once came against Jerusalem would one day ascend to worship the king. Even in the darkest visions of invasion and war, the prophets left windows open for wonder. Because this is who our God is, the one who called Rahab righteous, the one who made Ruth an ancestor of David, the one who transformed Saul into Paul and turned a cross into a crown, the God who specializes in impossible redemptions and unthinkable transformations. You are living in the days the prophets longed to see. You are witnessing headlines they wrote in tears and visions. The tensions you watch on the evening news were forecasted by voices that spoke from the whirlwind. The alliances forming in shadows were mapped by men who saw tomorrow through the lens of eternity. Iran's missiles may be aimed at Jerusalem, but heaven's eyes are fixed on something deeper. The spiritual war raging above the headlines. The battle for every soul caught between the promise and the threat. The question echoing from Eden to Armageddon. Will you bow to the King of Kings, or will you raise your fist against the Ancient of Days? This is not just Iran's choice. It is yours. It is mine. It is every heart that beats between the first prophecy and the last. Because the same God who knew Cyrus by name before Cyrus drew breath knows your name too. The same power that moved through Esther's courage can move through your obedience. The same mercy that spared Nineveh can reach the most hardened heart, the most bitter nation, the most impossible case. So watch, pray, stand alert in these prophetic hours, because the scrolls are still unrolling, the prophecies are still breathing, and somewhere in the councils of heaven, the final chapter is being written. The earth will tremble, nations will rage, but the king is coming. And when he arrives, every knee will bow, Persian knees, Israeli knees, American knees, your knees and mine. Because in God's hand, even ashes can become altars, and Persia's flame may rise again, this time in worship.